Cut her share $2.3 million is wasted on someone like that. Elise giggled loud enough for the whole room to hear, and for a moment the entire conference space in downtown Portland felt smaller than a shoebox. Her laugh was sharp-polished and meant to slice. I sat there, frozen fingers wrapped tight around the old silver watch my grandfather gave me years ago, the only thing that ever made me feel grounded. Elise stood up as if she were on some kind of stage, tossing her hair back with the confidence of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. Her heels clicked as she circled the table slightly, putting herself dead center in the room as every cousin aunt and so-called respected elder watched her with approval. She smiled smugly, pleased with the cruelty she delivered so effortlessly, and the room erupted into soft laughter. Not loud, but loud enough. Loud enough to show me exactly how little my presence mattered. I had been dismissed before ignored, before overlooked more times than I could count, but this time it hit different. This time they were not just mocking me. They were trying to erase me from a fund I had personally contributed over $112,000 to while pretending I had no value at all. Elise leaned closer to the table, letting her voice drip with condescension as she added, "She is basically a walking calculator. What could she possibly do with control of a $2.3 million fund?" The room chuckled again. A few people nodded. My mother looked down at her hands as if avoiding eye contact would make her innocence believable. No one spoke up for me. No one said that I was the only one in this room with a degree in forensic accounting or actual experience in managing nonprofit budgets. No one reminded Elise that she had spent more money on spa trips in the last year than I had spent on myself in the last decade combined. I could not tell what stung more, Elise's words or the silence of every person I considered family. I swallowed hard, fighting the rise of heat in my cheeks as the shame pressed in, thick and suffocating. I was Lane Hart, 27, a forensic budget analyst for the Oregon Office for Nonprofit Integrity. I had audited multi-million-dollar organizations. I had testified in hearings. I had caught fraud schemes far more complex than anything sitting at this table. But none of that mattered here. Here I was, the girl who grew up cleaning up after everyone else, the girl who took the blame so Elise could shine, the girl whose mother once whispered, "You are too intense, you make people uncomfortable," the girl they could cut out without blinking. Elise crossed her arms satisfied and shot me a smirk that said she believed she had already won. She'd always been treated like the golden child, the brilliant star, the woman destined for admiration. Yet she had been the only one caught withdrawing from the fund without authorization years ago, something the family quietly covered up and blamed on a clerical error. She spent money like it was printed exclusively for her. She used our family fund like her personal ATM. Still, somehow, I was the one they framed as unworthy. The lawyer at the end of the table tried to restore order, clearing his throat, as he said that a decision had not been finalized. But Elise waved him off as if he were an annoying intern. "Come on, everyone knows," she said. "Lane does not belong in charge of anything important." My stomach tightened. My fingers curled harder around the watch until the ridges pressed into my skin. I looked around again. Not a single person defended me. Not even my mother, who finally looked up only to whisper, "Maybe Elise is right. Lane does not understand real responsibility." The words hit harder than the laughter, harder than Elise's smirk, harder than the betrayal written across every face in that room. I felt the floor tilt under me, but I kept my posture straight. I forced myself to breathe. I forced myself to remember who I really was, and not the version they had created to keep Elise comfortable. If they wanted a quiet doormat, they chose the wrong woman today. Something in me shifted. Not anger, not fear, just clarity. Clear enough to cut through every lie they had told themselves about me for years. So I stood up, not to argue, not to defend myself, but to watch them crumble under the truth they have ignored for years. If you have ever been dismissed by the people who should have protected you, tell me your story. I am listening. I grew up in Eastmoreland, a quiet corner of Portland, lined with old oak trees and houses that looked warm from the outside, yet held shadows behind their windows. And in our house, those shadows always seemed to settle on me, even long before I understood what favoritism was, or how a family could smile at neighbors while tearing itself apart one careful gesture at a time. Elise was the sun in my mother's eyes, the daughter she bragged about at book club, the girl whose school drawings were framed in the hallway and whose slightest accomplishment was celebrated as if she had discovered a new planet, while I was the one who learned early to step lightly, to speak softly, to make myself small, in a home where attention felt like a spotlight that burned instead of warmed. My mother treated Elise like a fragile treasure and treated me like the steady pair of hands meant to hold everything together without complaint. And for years, I convinced myself this was normal, that some children were simply built to serve the rhythm of the household while others were built to be admired. And if I followed the rules and stayed quiet, maybe I would eventually earn a sliver of the affection that Elise received without lifting a finger. It started small, as these things always do. A broken vase that Elise knocked off the hallway table during one of her dramatic spins, the way she gasped and then looked straight at me with those wide, innocent eyes, telling our mother I had run into her on purpose, that I had been jealous because she was practicing for her dance recital. And before I could even form words, my mother was already ushering Elise away with comforting hands while ordering me to sweep up the shards and scrub the floor because clumsiness was unbecoming and responsibility built character. And I learned that day that silence was safer than arguing, because arguing only made the punishments harsher. From then on, Elise discovered how useful I was as a shield, something she wielded with growing skill, blaming me for stains she created, messes she ignored, homework she forgot, and my mother accepted every word as if Elise spoke gospel truth, never questioning how one child could be flawless, while the other supposedly left a trail of small disasters behind her. And each time I accepted the blame, I felt a faint flicker inside me, dim, a small piece of self-worth fading beneath their certainty that I was the problem. Yet in that same house lived one person who seemed to see through the performance, my grandfather, a quiet man with calloused hands and eyes that held more understanding than judgment. And he would sit with me on the back porch during summer evenings when the cicadas hummed and the air smelled of cut grass, asking gentle questions that invited truth instead of fear. And somehow I always found myself telling him everything, including the things I dared not say out loud to anyone else. He listened without rushing me. And when I finished, he would tap the top of my hand and tell me that people often lie to protect their egos, but numbers do not. And if I learned to follow the patterns and trust what I could prove, I would never be lost, no matter how many people tried to rewrite reality around me. Numbers do not lie, lane people do. He said once with a seriousness that made the words sink deep into my memory, and even as a child I understood he was preparing me for the world inside our home, as much as the world outside it. When I was 11, he handed me a small silver watch, its surface slightly scratched, yet polished with care, telling me it had guided him through decades of decisions and that it would do the same for me, because some tools were not about time, but about grounding, about reminding oneself that clarity existed even in chaos. And I remember turning the watch over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, anchor something inside me that had been drifting for years. I wore it every day after that, tucked under my sleeve, so Elise wouldn't see and call it ugly or outdated. And whenever the house erupted with accusations or chores unfairly piled on me, I would touch the watch to steady my breath, tracing the cool metal as a reminder that not everyone believed I was the disaster Elise claimed. But the defining moment of my childhood came in 2010, when Elise shattered a decorative lamp in the living room, a glass piece my mother adored. And when the crash echoed through the house, Elise spun toward me instantly with that same practiced innocence, and before I could even form a denial, she cried out that I had pushed her, that I had been jealous again, that I had ruined something precious for no reason, and my mother arrived with panic turning to anger so fast I barely recognized her face. I tried to explain, truly tried, but Elise wept dramatically and clung to her, and within seconds my mother sentenced me to scrub the entire first floor and rake the backyard before dinner, a punishment so disproportionate it finally made something in my chest twist in a way that felt new and unwelcome. As I crouched on the living room floor picking up broken pieces, the resentment began to form in quiet layers. Not fiery anger, but a cold awareness that no matter how perfectly I behaved, I would always be the easy target, the daughter who absorbed the impact so Elise could shine untouched. That night, my grandfather found me sitting on the porch steps long after the chores were done, my hands still smelling of cleaning solution, and he sat beside me without asking what happened, simply placing his hand over mine and telling me that the world was filled with people who would break things and then look for someone else to blame, and my survival would depend on knowing the truth even when the truth was painful. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling for the first time in my young life that someone saw me not as the shadow in Elise's spotlight, but as a person with weight and worth. And even now, as an adult, I can trace every important decision I have made back to those moments on the porch, to the watch on my wrist, to the quiet lessons he gave me about patterns and people, and how lies unravel if you are patient enough. Those years shaped me into someone capable, analytical, quietly resilient, someone who learned to excel without asking for praise and to endure without collapsing. And while that resilience would one day help me expose the truth behind the $2.3 million betrayal, it was in Eastmoreland that the seeds were planted long before the family fund ever existed. By the time I left Eastmoreland for the University of Oregon, I carried with me not only my grandfather's watch, but years of quiet conditioning that told me to push harder than anyone else if I wanted even the smallest piece of stability in college. Became the first place where my effort was not dismissed as obligation but recognized as skill, where professors noticed how quickly I understood financial patterns and encouraged me to pursue forensic accounting, a field that felt like an extension of the lessons my grandfather whispered during those porch nights, a field where truth lived in numbers instead of opinions. I graduated in 2018 with honors, and within months I was hired as one of the youngest analysts at the Oregon Office for Nonprofit Integrity, a job that demanded precision and calm under pressure traits I had been forced to master long before adulthood, and while others my age were still figuring out how to manage their budgets, I was already tracing complex transactions and uncovering discrepancies hidden beneath layers of administrative noise. I earned a solid salary for someone in their early 20s, yet I kept my lifestyle simple, partly because I had grown up understanding the fragility of money, and partly because I liked the quiet pride of watching my investment accounts grow little by little, as I funneled a portion of every paycheck into index funds and long-term holdings. By 2023, my portfolio had climbed past $400,000, a number I never shared with anyone because privacy felt safer. And I learned early that when people knew what you had, they immediately recalculated what you were worth to them. I also bought a small condo outside Portland, a modest place with soft light and affordable taxes, and I rented it to a nurse who kept the space neat and reliable, allowing the property to pay for itself while becoming a quiet piece of security in my future. But none of this mattered to my family because they had decided years ago that any money I made was temporary, unimportant, or simply available for them to claim, and the moment I received my first real paycheck, the requests started in a steady stream that never seemed to slow. It began with something small, a forgotten electricity bill that my mother claimed Elise accidentally misplaced, then a dental copay that my aunt insisted was an emergency, then a credit card payment. My mother whispered she could not make because times were hard despite the fact that Elise was shopping online almost daily and receiving packages that filled the living room floor. Each time I paid, I told myself it was easier to help than to argue, easier to keep peace than to explain boundaries to people who had no intention of respecting them anyway, and I transferred money with the same numb acceptance that shaped my childhood, believing that perhaps generosity would eventually be reciprocated, even though deep down, I knew better. The escalation came in 2021 when my mother called sobbing about her credit card balance, claiming she had been scammed into a subscription and needed only a small amount to clear the account. So I logged in, using the access she provided, and stared at the truth laid out in simple numbers, recognizing instantly that there were no scams at all, only charges from boutiques and online stores and restaurants she had never mentioned. And even though disappointment settled in my chest, I paid the balance anyway, because I could not stand the idea of her falling apart at the thought of debt collectors. I never mentioned the truth. I simply covered the entire amount, a little over $2,000, and told her it was handled, hoping she would feel relieved enough to make better choices. Instead, she told the family that I had embarrassed her by checking her account so thoroughly, twisting the story into something ugly, suggesting that I paid the debt only to shame her and make myself look important. And I overheard Elise telling a cousin during a barbecue that I only helped so I could feel superior. I stood there with my plate of grilled vegetables, wondering how a gesture meant to bring peace could be turned into a strike against me so effortlessly, and I realized that in this family, any goodwill I offered would always be measured against Elise's curated image of flawlessness. Elise never lifted a finger to help anyone financially, yet they praised her presence as if she brought fortune simply by standing in the room while I, who worked late nights and saved diligently, was painted as calculating or self-serving whenever I tried to ease the burdens they placed on themselves. It became a pattern so predictable I could almost time it. The requests arriving in messages about a medical bill here or a school supply purchase there, always framed as temporary or minor, yet adding up to hundreds each month. And whenever I hesitated even slightly, I was reminded that family supports family, which in their language meant I was the designated safety net, while Elise was the treasured centerpiece shielded from every adult responsibility. Still, I maintained my quiet discipline, building my career and expanding my knowledge. Auditing nonprofits by day and reviewing my investments by night, learning to navigate spreadsheets and human behavior with equal precision, and whenever the weight of their expectations grew too heavy, I touched the cool metal of my grandfather's watch and reminded myself that truth had a rhythm numbers could always reveal. In late 2023, despite everything, or perhaps because I needed to feel connected to something bigger than the constant cycle of giving and being misunderstood, I made a private decision that had nothing to do with their approval, transferring $11,700 into the family fund that my grandfather helped establish years earlier, telling no one, not Elise, not my mother, not any cousin, just quietly placing my contribution into the lineage he once believed would uphold integrity. I did it because he would have wanted the fund to remain strong, and because despite my family's treatment, I still believed in the value of building something lasting, something tied to legacy, rather than entitlement, and that silent deposit would later become the very detail they tried to use against me when they claimed I did not deserve access to the fund at all, unaware that the numbers they dismissed so easily would eventually expose every truth they tried to bury. By August of 2024, the summer heat in Portland felt heavier than usual, not because the temperature was remarkable, but because the house and the family surrounding it seemed to hum with a tension that had been building ever since my grandfather passed. And with his absence, the family fund he once oversaw with meticulous care had become the center of whispered conversations and pointed suggestions about who should take over, even though deep down everyone knew only two people had the financial background for it, myself, and the one person who had spent years treating the fund like her personal dream wallet, Elise. The first official review meeting was approaching, and something in my chest tightened each time I remembered how my grandfather used to speak about the fund as a legacy tool, something meant to help future generations with education, housing, and emergencies, never for vanity or excess. And in the weeks before the meeting, I found myself unable to ignore the uneasiness that had been creeping in since the last annual report. A report Elise had submitted alone during the period when she held temporary access, claiming she was simply tying up loose ends until a new custodian was chosen. One evening, after a long audit shift, I opened the family fund database out of habit, the same way some people absent-mindedly check the weather. And as the numbers arranged themselves on my screen, I felt my breath stall, because the expenses did not match the conservative spending patterns that had defined the fund for decades. The first red flag was a charge of $87,000 categorized as wellness retreat and skincare restoration, a description vague enough to raise suspicion and dramatic enough to sound fabricated. And when I traced the vendor information, I nearly laughed out of disbelief because it led to a luxury spa in Beverly Hills, offering treatments that cost more per hour than most people earned in a week. And I knew instantly that no one in our family had any legitimate business spending fund money on that. I scrolled further and found $56,000 listed as travel expense for educational trip, supposedly a cultural enrichment program, and yet the flight records linked to the booking, which I accessed with 2 clicks since the airline confirmation was attached, showed round-trip tickets to Hawaii purchased during the exact week Elise had flooded her social media with sunset selfies and beach cocktails, documenting a girls' trip she had bragged about for months. My hands began to tingle, that familiar sensation I always felt when numbers finally revealed what people tried to hide. And I opened the master ledger comparing this year's statement to the one from 2 years prior, a simple side-by-side that made my stomach tighten in a way that felt both validating and nauseating, because the math was unarguable. The fund had lost $640,000 in under 2 years, a bleed so severe it would have been impossible to justify under any legitimate circumstance, yet somehow the family either had not noticed or had chosen not to look at all. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that number settle over me, remembering how my grandfather used to run calculations on yellow notepads, storing every receipt in neatly labeled boxes that I used to help him organize, and the contrast between his discipline and the recklessness now stamped across the database felt like a personal betrayal, layered atop the family betrayal I had been born into. The access logs confirmed what I already feared. Elise had been the only person with temporary control during the period. The withdrawals occurred a fact she would certainly try to spin into an innocent coincidence. And as I dug deeper into the digital files, I noticed something even more troubling. A bitmap distortion on one of the authorization forms, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of pixel inconsistency that appears only when a signature has been copy-pasted onto a document. I zoomed in further, my pulse steadying, in that strange way it always did when the truth emerged, and I could see the faint misalignment between the signature image and the document texture, something even an amateur investigator would have flagged, but something Elise must have believed no one would think to inspect. I sat there staring at the screen, the truth glowing back at me in cold numbers and manipulated pixels, and for a brief moment I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what this discovery meant not only for the fund, but for the political battlefield I knew was coming. If Elise had risked forging signatures and siphoning money at this magnitude, she would not hesitate to twist narratives, gather allies, and turn the entire family against me. The moment she sensed, I understood what she had done. She had always used charm as a weapon and ignorance as a shield, and with stakes this high, she would need a scapegoat, someone she could paint as unfit or selfish or incompetent to distract from her own actions. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was the perfect target in her eyes, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who had always absorbed blame so easily that the family barely noticed. I imagine the meeting scheduled for September, the polished conference table, the relatives nodding along with Elise's sugary voice as she argued for new leadership claiming change was needed, while positioning herself as the victim of administrative confusion and positioning me, the forensic analyst, as the problem. I knew they would try to remove me from any consideration, not because I lacked qualification, but because my knowledge posed a threat to the fragile image they had built for Elise, and if the truth of her spending ever surfaced, it would unravel not only her reputation, but the entire narrative the family clung to about her perfection. I opened a blank document and began saving copies of every suspicious expense, every signature discrepancy, every access log, the beginning of a private archive that would later become my shield. And as I compiled the evidence, I felt the watch on my wrist press lightly against my skin, reminding me of my grandfather's voice, telling me that numbers do not lie even when people do. The room around me grew dim as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the glow of the screen illuminating the certainty that settled deep inside me. The certainty that my family would rather rewrite the truth than face the consequences of Elise's choices, and that before they could erase me from the fund entirely, I would have to decide whether to stay silent as I had for most of my life, or to prepare for a confrontation they never expected from the daughter they believed would always stay small. The meeting room in downtown Portland smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee, the kind of scent that usually calmed me during audits, yet on that September afternoon it felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to fracture, and I sat at the long conference table with my folder of documents tucked neatly beside me, listening to the murmur of relatives filling the seats while pretending not to watch me, even though their glances drifted in my direction with that familiar mixture of dismissal and expectation. The fund attorney, a composed man named Carlton Hayes, who had handled my grandfather's estate for decades, adjusted his files and cleared his throat, trying to bring structure to a family that rarely respected structure. And just as he was about to begin, the door swung open with all the theatrical energy of a staged entrance, and Elise stepped inside wearing oversized sunglasses, a shimmering top, and a smile that carried the confidence of someone who believed the world would always rearrange itself to flatter her. Several relatives clapped as if she were arriving at a party rather than a financial review meeting, and she wiggled her fingers in a playful wave before sliding into a seat directly across from me, giving me a look of amused pity, the kind of look she had perfected since childhood. Carlton resumed the agenda, outlining the need for a new fund custodian emphasizing the importance of financial clarity and ethical oversight, and when he listed my credentials with professional enthusiasm, explaining my forensic background and my track record with nonprofit audits, I noticed a ripple of surprise move through the room, as if the family had never seriously considered that someone like me had an actual career, or that competence mattered more than charisma in something as serious as multi-million-dollar fund stewardship. Elise let out a soft laugh when Carlton suggested I was the most qualified candidate, a laugh that grew louder as she leaned back in her chair, flipping her hair with exaggerated grace, and before he could continue, she raised her voice just enough to command the entire room. Cut her share. $2.3 million is wasted on someone like that, she said with a smirk that curled at the edges, and the moment the words hit the air, it felt as though the floor shifted beneath me, not because the insult was new, but because she said it with such public certainty, as if I were an obstacle to clear, rather than a human being sitting less than 3 feet away. The relatives reacted instantly, a mixture of awkward chuckles and silent nods, their discomfort evaporating as soon as Elise repeated that I lacked the personality for leadership, framing her cruelty as practical wisdom. And then she added another blow that sent a cold spark racing down my spine, claiming I was not family material. A phrase she delivered with a casual shrug as if it were an obvious truth rather than a dagger aimed with precision. Carlton attempted to intervene, reminding everyone that the discussion should remain respectful, but Elise waved him off and continued speaking as though she had been elected queen of the room, despite having contributed nothing to the fun beyond draining it. I looked around, then hoping for even one face to reflect concern or disbelief, someone who might question her authority or defend basic fairness, but every gaze avoided mine, and the echo of my grandfather's absence settled heavy in my chest. The twist arrived not from Elise, but from the one person I still harbored a fragment of hope, from my mother, who had remained quiet up to that point. Hands folded, eyes lowered, and when she finally spoke, she did not hesitate or soften her tone. She simply aligned herself with Elise with the effortless ease of someone who had practiced this loyalty for years. Elise is right. She said loud enough for the entire room to hear Lane does not understand real responsibility, and in that instant the air thinned around me, the room blurring at the edges as her words layered themselves atop old wounds. I thought I had outgrown wounds that suddenly pulsed with the same ache they carried when I was a child, sweeping floors for mistakes I did not make. I had suspected she would not defend me, but I had not expected her to reinforce the lie so directly, nor to say it with such conviction, as if my years of financial discipline, my documented successes, my contributions to the fund itself were irrelevant compared to Elise's charm and theatrics. Carlton tried once more to redirect the meeting, attempting to outline a formal evaluation process, but the family barely listened, already nodding along with the narrative Elise had crafted, already deciding that my quiet competence was a flaw rather than a qualification, already shifting their allegiance toward the person they believed would keep them entertained rather than accountable. I felt the watch on my wrist press against my skin, grounding me as the conversation continued around me, and while I sat silent, I realized that the betrayal unfolding in front of me was not simply about the fund or Elise's theft, or even the insult of being excluded. It was about something far deeper. The confirmation that my family had never truly seen me as part of them, that I had been a placeholder in their narrative, someone convenient to use, when it suited them, but disposable, when truth became uncomfortable. My mother's voice lingered in my ears, heavy and sharp, and I felt something in me shift, not break, but transform, as if the years of staying quiet had finally reached their natural endpoint. Elise slid a victorious smile across the table, certain she had won, certain I would shrink as I always had, and I stared back at her with a stillness she mistook for defeat, unaware that the evidence sitting in my folder contained the exact pattern of transactions that would unravel every piece of her performance. They believed I would disappear from the conversation, that I would comply the way I had been conditioned to comply. Yet in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that the truth they dismissed so easily would soon destroy the illusion they clung to, and the meeting that was meant to humiliate me would become the first step in pulling apart every lie Elise had built around herself. When the meeting finally ended, I walked out of the downtown building with the kind of silence inside me that did not feel peaceful, but hollow. A silence shaped by the sound of my own mother agreeing that I lacked responsibility, and the echo of Elise's laughter still clinging to my skin like something corrosive. And as I made my way to the parking garage, the city around me seemed strangely distant, the noise of traffic muted, as if my body were moving through water rather than air. I unlocked my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, letting the weight of everything settle the betrayal heavy enough to press against my ribs, and for a moment I told myself that surely someone in that room must have felt uneasy about the cruelty they participated in. Yet I knew the truth. Before the thought even formed, the family had always been eager to align themselves with Elise, because her confidence made them feel important by association, and I had always been the expendable one, the daughter who absorbed blame, so they would not have to confront the dysfunction that ran through all of us. When I finally drove home, the sky had darkened, streaks of orange fading into gray, and as I stepped into my small apartment, the quiet felt different than usual, not comforting, but sharp a reminder of how alone I truly was in this fight. I turned on a lamp and let myself sink onto the couch, still wearing the same clothes from the meeting, my hands trembling slightly from the shock that had not yet fully processed, and before I knew it, tears began to form. Not loud or dramatic, tears but slow ones, the kind that come when your last strand of hope snaps without warning. I wiped them away quickly, almost angrily, because sadness felt too easy, too familiar, and beneath the grief, something else was beginning to take shape, a cold determination that spread through me like a slow awakening, reminding me that Elise's performance had not erased the truth I held in my folder, nor the duty I felt toward my grandfather's legacy. When my phone buzzed, I expected it to be a message from a coworker or a bank notification, but instead, it was a video posted by a cousin showing Elise twirling in the middle of someone's living room, while relatives cheered around her, the caption reading, "Celebrating removing dead weight from the fund," and seeing her grin so confidently felt like a knife slipping between the ribs. Not because I wanted their approval, but because their eagerness to celebrate my exclusion confirmed that the family had not simply allowed Elise's lies, they embraced them. I turned off the phone, set it face down, and tried to breathe through the tightness gathering in my throat. And that was when I remembered an old email from my grandfather, one I had archived, but never deleted, sent in late 2022 during the period when his health had begun to decline. But his mind was still precise enough to notice when something was off. I opened my laptop, typed his name into the search bar, and there it was, an email titled "Just in Case," written in his calm, unhurried tone, reminding me that if anything ever seemed wrong with the fund, I should check the folder labeled "Original Charter," stored in the shared family archive. My fingers hovered for a moment before clicking into the archive, and when I found the folder, my pulse quickened, because the document inside did not match the one Elise had printed and presented at the meeting, not in structure, not in content, not even in formatting. The original charter clearly outlined a rotating custodial review, mandatory transparency audits, and restrictions on discretionary spending, while Elise's version conveniently removed those sections and replaced them with ambiguous language that allowed temporary custodians more freedom, language that would have justified her massive withdrawals if no one ever compared the two documents side by side. I stared at the discrepancy, anger rising like a steady tide. Not fiery, but focused, the kind of anger that clears the mind rather than blurs it. And I realized that my grandfather had suspected something long before anyone else, that his final gift to me was not simply the watch on my wrist, but the instructions that would eventually expose the truth he feared the family would ignore. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was the family group chat, lighting up with messages, each one more dismissive than the last, as if they sensed I might push back. "Lane, do not make this a spectacle." One aunt wrote, followed by another relative saying the fund has already moved on, accept it gracefully. And then my mother chimed in with a message that made my jaw tighten. "Lane, do not dig into this, or you will lose the family altogether. It is not worth it." I stared at the screen, rereading the words. Lose the family, feeling the implications settle like a stone in my stomach, and something in me snapped with a clarity so sharp it almost felt physical. A clarity that told me they were not warning me out of concern, but out of fear, that the truth would unravel everything they had decided to believe. I typed slowly, not out of hesitation, but because each word needed to be exact. Then maybe I never had one. And the moment I pressed send, I felt an unexpected calm wash through me. Not comfort, but resolve, the kind that grows when illusion finally shatters and you see people exactly as they are, rather than how you once hoped they could be. I closed the chat-saved copies of the original charter along with every document I had analyzed so far and leaned back in my chair with the knowledge that I was no longer simply reacting to their betrayal. I was preparing to confront it with every tool my grandfather had taught me to use, and whatever came next would not be shaped by their approval or intimidation, but by the truth they had underestimated for far too long. The night after, I answered the family group chat with the sentence that felt like the closing of a door. I had been knocking on my entire life. I sat at my dining table surrounded by printed ledgers, laptop, open files arranged in a meticulous circle, and for the first time since the meeting, I felt something close to clarity rising within me. Not the soft, gentle clarity people talk about in meditation books, but the sharp, analytical kind that activates when patterns finally snap into place and emotion gives way to precision. My grandfather used to say that truth lives in timelines, so I began there, opening spreadsheets and cross-referencing dates from the fund withdrawals, with every scrap of information I had gathered, including the original charter, the access logs, and the inconsistent signatures that still glowed in my memory like warning lights. I created a master timeline marking each suspicious withdrawal, tracing them through the bank statements and matching them with Elise's known travel dates, which I found easily since she documented her life online with the confidence of someone who believed consequences did not apply to her. And as the timeline stretched across my screen, I could already see the outline of something more sophisticated than mere impulsive spending. Next, I compared the IP addresses logged during online transactions to the known household networks from the family home as well as Elise's apartment, and something felt off immediately because several large withdrawals had been made from an unfamiliar IP that traced back to a small commercial building in the Pearl District, a location I recognized because it housed a satellite branch of the Bank of Cascadia, the same bank listed on an odd transfer slip I had noticed earlier but had not yet examined fully. Opening that slip again, I followed the routing number to a secondary account, labeled with an abbreviation that looked unofficial, almost like a placeholder name. And when I traced subsequent transfers, I saw amounts from the family fund passing briefly through that account before landing in a personal spending account tied to Elise's social security number. The pattern repeated like choreography fund to holding account to personal account, then immediately into retail purchases, including a Chanel boutique transaction for $5,800, followed by another for $6,200, then a deposit at a dealership that matched the down payment for a white Mercedes convertible Elise had posted online. During the same week, she told everyone she got an unbelievable discount through a friend. My stomach tightened as I pulled the dealership receipts cross-checking the dates and matching them to fund withdrawals. And before I could catch my breath, another set of charges appeared, hundreds spent at cosmetic clinics in downtown Portland, followed by significantly larger payments to a surgical center known for aesthetic rhinoplasty and facial contouring procedures, all categorized in Elise's personal ledger as wellness maintenance, which might have sounded plausible if the money had not originated from a fund meant to support education, housing, and emergencies. The more I traced the flows of money, the more elaborate the scheme became, and I realized, with a sinking sense of disbelief, that Elise had not simply dipped into the fund impulsively. She had built an entire loop of transactions designed to mask her spending by redirecting large sums through a temporary account that bore enough resemblance to a legitimate fund sub-account that an untrained eye might overlook it. But I was not an untrained eye, and as I dug deeper, I opened the security footage request from the Bank of Cascadia branch, which I had sent earlier that week, and when the file finally downloaded, I felt my pulse quicken, because the timestamp matched one of the largest withdrawal entries exactly to the minute. I pressed play, expecting to see a stranger or perhaps a bank employee handling the transaction. Yet there she was, walking confidently into the branch, wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a designer tote, pausing at the teller window with a bright smile. The same hour she had told the family she was at a wellness retreat, and the same hour her social media showed her receiving a clay mask treatment at a spa 20 minutes away. Forensics has taught me that people rarely hide the truth consistently across platforms, and Elise's overconfidence made my work easier, because while she pretended to live a glamorous life, her transactions betrayed a different story, and her timestamps betrayed her alibi. When I lined the footage beside the bank log and the fund withdrawal record, the pieces merged into a single unshakable truth that Elise was not simply reckless. She was orchestrating a scheme that met the threshold of felony-level financial fraud, the kind that triggered mandatory investigations, the kind that could not be brushed aside by family loyalty or performative tears. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the magnitude of what I had uncovered, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal, but also a growing sense of resolve, because this was no longer about proving my worthiness to a family that had already dismissed me. This was about protecting a fund built by someone who taught me to respect integrity and to follow numbers, not narratives. As I reviewed the evidence, I realized something else. This investigation was no longer hypothetical. I needed direct confirmation, something that tied Elise's intent to her actions, and I knew exactly how to get it, because Elise thrived on bragging when she believed she held power, and she trusted that no one would question her. I reached for my phone, scrolling through her recent messages, and began planning how to approach her in a way that would seem casual enough to lower her guard, yet pointed enough to provoke one of her signature careless confessions. And before I closed my laptop that night, I placed a small digital recorder in my purse, one that could be activated with a single touch hidden beneath the table or pressed casually against my leg. The watch on my wrist caught the light as I moved, and for a brief moment I wondered if my grandfather had ever imagined this path for me, confronting not only a family built on selective truths, but the person who had benefited most from the silence that used to define me. And as I turned off the lamp, I felt no fear, only certainty that the next conversation with Elise would not be for her benefit or approval, but for the truth she had spent years believing she could outrun. 2 days after mapping out the full chain of Elise's transactions, I texted her with a short message suggesting we catch up over coffee in the Pearl District, choosing a cafe with wide windows and steady afternoon crowds so that her natural instinct to perform would take over, making her more talkative, more careless, more certain of her power. And she responded almost instantly with an enthusiastic yes, followed by a winking emoji, as if the meeting were something she had orchestrated rather than something I had set into motion with deliberate precision. When I arrived early, I selected a small table near the back, where the noise blended into a low hum, creating the perfect cover for subtle recording. And I slipped my phone beneath a folded napkin, keeping the voice memo app ready so that with a slight tap I could begin documenting whatever she chose to reveal, trusting that arrogance would lead her exactly where I needed her to go. Elise entered the cafe with predictable flair, wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream blazer that seemed impractical for the warm day, yet perfectly suited for the image she tried to maintain. And when she spotted me, she removed her glasses with a flourish and offered a smile that looked triumphant, rather than friendly. A smile that seemed to say she believed the meeting was about my surrender or apology, rather than my investigation. She barely sat down before launching into a monologue about how exhausting family drama could be, how she had been inundated with supportive messages after the meeting, how everyone agreed she had been courageous for calling out my supposed irresponsibility. And as she spoke, she toyed with her straw, stirring her iced latte with the assuredness of someone who thought the universe rewarded her simply for existing. I allowed her to ramble for several minutes before gently steering the conversation toward the fund, mentioning casually that the attorney had sent follow-up questions and that I was reviewing old records just to ensure everything aligned. And the instant I said the word records, she leaned forward with a conspiratorial grin, the kind she used when she believed she had outsmarted everyone. Even if they check, she said, lowering her voice slightly, I already deleted the original transactions. No one will ever know the difference. And the way she said it so boldly, so casually made it clear she had no understanding of how digital forensics worked or how many layers of verification existed in modern banking. Yet she looked proud of herself as though she had performed some masterful heist instead of committing fraud detectable by any mid-level analyst. I tapped my phone beneath the napkin, preserving her words, then lifted my cup to hide the small exhale that escaped me. not from fear, but from the surreal realization that she was confessing freely in public, without the faintest suspicion that I had already accessed the server logs, the mirrored backups, and the metadata her deletion had not touched. She continued speaking, not noticing the shift in my expression, as she described the fund as a convenient resource, a safety net she deserved because her lifestyle reflected well on the family. And as she spoke, she referred to me as her punching bag, saying it lightly as if it were an affectionate joke. Then elaborated that I had spent years absorbing responsibilities so she could focus on looking good and enjoying life, claiming I was like an ATM with feelings, a phrase she delivered with a laugh that rippled across the table like static. The cruelty of her words did not sting the way they once might have, because I had already accepted what she was long before this moment, and her confession only solidified the truth I needed to hold. But hearing the disdain out loud made my determination tighten, made the watch on my wrist feel heavier, as if my grandfather himself were grounding me. I asked subtle follow-up questions playing into her ego, encouraging her to elaborate, and she did with eager vanity, explaining how she had rerouted transactions so quickly, even a trained reviewer might not catch them, how she had crafted new authorization notes using templates she found online, and how she knew the family would never believe anything negative about her because they loved her too much to question her behavior. "Nobody will believe you," she said, leaning back with a smug tilt to her chin. "You are forgettable, Lane. You always have been." And the words floated in the air with a weight that once might have crushed me, but now only confirmed how blind she was to what I had already assembled. I felt the smallest smile tug at the corner of my mouth, a quiet, measured smile, not of amusement, but recognition. The smile of someone who finally sees the path forward, because the opponent has unknowingly surrendered the final piece needed for victory, and Elise mistook it for embarrassment, making her sit even taller, as if she believed she had won another imaginary battle. She reached for her phone, scrolling through pictures from her recent trips, showing me outfits from Hawaii bags she bought in Los Angeles, and a selfie taken at the very spa, whose charges I had traced earlier, never realizing that each photo was another thread tying her to the fraudulent transactions she thought she had erased. I let her talk uninterrupted, letting her reveal the full scope of her entitlement and the breadth of her deceit, recording every word, every tone, every careless confession. And when she finally paused to sip her drink, she looked at me with a patronizing softness and said, "Lane, you worry too much. Everything always works out for me in the end." I nodded slowly, holding her gaze, letting her believe the moment belonged to her, while inside me a calm certainty settled like the final click of a lock, because I knew the truth no longer needed to be found, it only needed to be presented, and Elise had just given me the perfect evidence to do exactly that. The morning I scheduled the second family meeting, the air in Portland felt unusually crisp, the kind of early autumn sharpness that wakes every nerve, and as I prepared my files, printing backup copies, checking timestamps, verifying metadata, I felt no panic, only a steady rising focus, as if every step I had taken since childhood had been leading to this room, this moment, this unraveling. I arrived early at the downtown conference room, choosing the same table where Elise had mocked me, humiliated me, dismissed me, and I set up the projector, connecting my laptop, arranging documents into a clean sequence, because clarity mattered here, not theatrics. And when relatives began filtering in, whispering, glancing at me with a mix of irritation and curiosity, I simply nodded, offering no explanation beyond the email I had sent requesting their presence. Elise was one of the last to walk in, wearing a pastel dress and an expression of bored confidence, as though she had agreed to attend only to humor me. And when she took her seat, she avoided my gaze, pretending to scroll her phone, completely unaware of the evidence lined up in perfect chronological order on the screen behind me. When the room settled, I stood up, not waiting for permission, and began with the same calm tone I used in professional audits, explaining that I had reviewed the fund documents and discovered discrepancies that required immediate attention. And for a brief moment, the room quieted, as if they sensed something different in the cadence of my voice, something unshakable. I clicked the first slide, revealing a simple timeline stretching across 2 years, showing each withdrawal marked with color-coded notes, cross-referenced with dates of Elise's known travel and online activity, and I watched confusion ripple across their faces as the pattern emerged, a pattern too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Before anyone could interrupt, I shifted to the next slide, listing individual transactions: the $87,000 spent at the Beverly Hills Spa, the $56,000 travel charge that aligned with Elise's Hawaii trip. The cascading withdrawals adding up to $640,000, all traced back to the window of time in which Elise held temporary access. And as murmurs spread through the room, Elise's shoulders stiffened, though she kept her gaze fixed on her phone, pretending to remain unbothered. I advanced to the next set of evidence photo receipts matched to timestamps, showing designer purchases, the Chanel bags the dealership deposit for the Mercedes, alongside screenshots of her social media posts. Flaunting the same items and gasps rose from the relatives who had once applauded her lifestyle, believing it was funded by legitimate success rather than siphoned family resources. Carlton, the attorney, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, clearly unsettled, as I displayed the CCTV still image from the Bank of Cascadia branch, the timestamp glowing at the bottom corner, identical to the digital record of a major withdrawal, and the room fell silent as everyone recognized Elise in the frame, despite her sunglasses, despite her attempt to appear inconspicuous. Elise finally raised her head, glancing around with growing agitation, before blurting out that the footage must be fake, edited, manipulated, and I allowed her protest to hang in the air for only a moment before clicking to the final slide, an audio waveform stretching across the screen. "This is from Saturday," I said, when Elise and I met for coffee. And before she could react, I pressed play, letting her own voice spill through the speakers filling the conference room with every arrogant syllable. Even if they check, I already deleted the original transactions, followed by the quick derisive laugh she had given, and then the words spoken so casually over iced coffee lane is just an ATM with feelings. No one will believe her, she is forgettable. And the recording ended with her final declaration. I deleted the original. Lane is too stupid to find out. For a full second, no one moved, no one breathed, no one blinked, and I stood there feeling the weight of years of silence lifting off my shoulders, replaced by something steadier, something stronger, and Elise's face paled so visibly it almost looked drained of its color entirely as she pushed back her chair, stumbling to her feet, muttering that this was a setup, that she had been tricked, that I had taken her words out of context, yet her panic betrayed her faster than the audio ever could. A few relatives gasped, others covered their mouths, and Carlton closed his binder slowly, as if mentally revising every assumption he had made about who was fit to manage the fund, and Elise bolted for the door, nearly knocking over a chair as she fled the room, unable to withstand the backlash that was only beginning to ripple through the crowd. I let the silence settle, letting each relative absorb what they had just heard, not rushing to fill the void, because the truth no longer needed my voice to defend it. The evidence spoke for itself, and when I finally stepped forward to turn off the projector, I spoke the final sentence, calmly, clearly allowing it to land exactly where it needed to. Numbers do not lie, and neither does the truth you tried to bury. I gathered my documents with steady hands, feeling the air shift around me as relatives exchanged looks, no longer united in blind loyalty to Elise, no longer certain of the narratives they had clung to so confidently. And as I walked toward the exit, the watch on my wrist caught the sunlight glinting like a quiet affirmation that this moment was not about revenge alone, but about restoring the integrity my grandfather had protected for decades. The fallout began before I even reached the parking garage, because the moment the conference room door closed behind me, the relatives who had once dismissed me scurried into tight little clusters, whispering loudly enough for the echoes to follow me down the hallway, and by the time I stepped out onto the street, my phone buzzed with a series of messages, each one angrier than the last, demanding explanations, demanding apologies, demanding that I take responsibility for the humiliation they claimed I had inflicted on them, rather than acknowledging the truth that had been exposed so cleanly it left no room for denial. When I arrived home, my mother was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, face flushed, with a mix of outrage and wounded pride, and the moment I approached, she launched into me asking why I would do something so cruel to my family, why I would air dirty laundry in a way that made us all look pathetic in front of lawyers and relatives and community members, and I stood there listening without interrupting because I already knew this pattern. Blame-shifting, rewriting history, assigning me the role of villain simply because it was easier than confronting the actual wrongdoing. When I calmly reminded her that Elise had committed the fraud, that Elise had mocked me, that Elise had humiliated me publicly, she cut me off with the sharpest sentence I had heard from her in years. "You should have just stayed quiet." And the words landed so hard that for a brief moment, I felt the version of myself at 13, at 16, at 22, re-emerge the version who always swallowed pain to keep the peace. But that version evaporated quickly, replaced by someone steadier. Someone who had finally learned that silence was its own form of surrender. The very next morning, the bank requested that I attend a formal review meeting and insisted the family join to address the status of the fund. And although I initially hesitated, the insistence in the banker's tone hinted at something unexpected, so I agreed. And as I arrived at the Bank of Cascadia headquarters, along with my mother and several cousins, and a visibly shaken Elise who wore oversized sunglasses, despite the cloudy sky, I felt the same tension as before. But now it was laced with anticipation rather than dread. We were escorted into a private conference room where a senior financial officer greeted us politely, then began reviewing the fund irregularities, confirming everything I had already shown the family, and when he mentioned that the account would undergo a legal audit, several relatives shifted uncomfortably clearly, undergoing the slow realization that this was far bigger than a family dispute over management rights. Elise attempted to argue that some withdrawals were misunderstandings, then changed tactics, claiming the transactions were approved verbally by other relatives, and finally insisted the system must have glitched. But the officer remained professional, simply stating that evidence would determine intent, not preferences or excuses. After reviewing the timeline, he turned to a separate folder and announced that while reviewing the lineage of the fund, they had discovered an adjacent account created by the previous custodian, my grandfather, and the moment he mentioned my grandfather's name, the room went still because everyone in that space understood his meticulous nature and his absolute intolerance for financial carelessness. The officer opened the folder, slowly pulling out a printout showing an account titled Heart Contingency Account, and beneath the title, in clear, bold lettering, was the beneficiary name Lane Hart, and several relatives gasped, while others leaned forward, squinting at the page, as if hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into a name more convenient for their expectations. And Elise froze completely, her entire body responding before her voice did. The officer explained that the account held $350,000, earmarked explicitly for me, established years earlier, and growing quietly with interest. And as he described the restrictions, my grandfather left instructions for a transfer only upon certain conditions related to my personal stability. I felt my throat tighten, not from shock, but from the softness of recognition, because I understood instantly that he had known. He had seen, he had anticipated every fracture in this family long before it became visible to me. Several relatives immediately began demanding to know why I had kept this secret, accusing me of deception, as though I had orchestrated the account's existence, rather than simply becoming aware of it in the same moment they did. And one cousin muttered loudly, "If she had this all along, why did she act like a victim?" While another hissed, "This makes us look foolish," as if the problem was the embarrassment rather than the financial misconduct Elise had committed. My mother's voice cut through theirs, trembling but sharp with resentment as she asked why he would leave something for me and not for Elise, not for the daughter she always believed more deserving, and the bitterness in her tone cracked against the polished surface of the room, revealing a truth she had never spoken so bluntly, because in her mind, my worth had always been conditional, always negotiable, always second place. Elise finally found her voice rising in a shrill disbelief as she demanded why her name was not listed, why she was not chosen, why I, of all people, would be the one entrusted with anything substantial. And her voice shook with a mixture of outrage and fear, because the loss of control terrified her more than any criminal investigation. The officer simply reiterated the facts that the account was real and legal and intentional, and as he handed me the folder, I felt the weight of the paper settle into my hands like a final quiet affirmation from the one person who had ever seen me clearly. I glanced down at the silver watch on my wrist, the watch my grandfather had given me when I was 15, with the inscription he never explained, but always meant. And in that moment, I realized he had anticipated that one day I would stand alone against a room of people who claimed to love me but benefited from my silence. And he had left me not only resources, but proof that he believed I deserved more than the role they assigned me. By the time the investigation formally opened, Elise had already begun to unravel because freezing her accounts meant her curated lifestyle collapsed in a matter of days, and losing her job at the event firm where she had charmed her way into a management title stripped away the last illusion she clung to, and every relative who once adored her suddenly kept their distance, leaving her with nothing but the consequences she had always believed she was too clever to face. For a brief moment, I thought she might disappear entirely, retreat into silence the way I once had, but Elise was never built for quiet. She was built for performance even in desperation, and so when the knock came at my apartment door late on a rainy Portland night, I knew before I opened it that she would be on the other side clinging to whatever scraps of control she imagined she still possessed. She stood there soaked from the drizzle mascara streaked down her cheeks, hair tangled from running hands through it, and the moment she saw my face, she collapsed into trembling sobs, not the elegant staged tears she used at family gatherings, but raw panicked crying that made her look younger and more frightened than I had ever seen her, and for a brief second, I wondered if this was the first time she had ever felt the weight of accountability. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, murmuring my name in a broken whisper while wiping her face repeatedly, leaving smudges on her sleeves, and when she reached my kitchen table, she set down a thick envelope, the kind that bulges with money even before it is opened, and she placed her shaking hands over it as though presenting an offering. She begged almost immediately, her voice quivering, as she asked me to withdraw the audit request, imploring me to think about the family, think about our reputation, think about how it would look if news spread further, and she kept repeating, "We can fix this, Lane. We can make this disappear if you help me." And beneath each plea was the old familiar entitlement, the assumption that I existed to clean up her messes, because that was the pattern she had thrived on for years. I did not touch the envelope, not yet, because I wanted to hear her say exactly what she believed would buy my silence. And eventually she opened it, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills bound with crisp bands, and she whispered that it was $200,000 in cash, pulled from the last liquidity she had before the freeze hit, and she slid it toward me as if expecting me to snatch it up immediately. "We are family," she said, voice cracking and trembling. "You and we have fought, but we are still bound. We can fix this together if you just look past what happened." And she added, I will give you everything you want if you help me. And the desperation in her tone made it clear that she saw this not as repentance but negotiation, a reforming of the hierarchy she had always benefited from. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for the remote and turned on the television, letting the evening news flash across the screen. And the anchor's voice filled the apartment with the announcement that a local woman, Elise Hart, was under investigation for alleged financial misconduct involving a family charitable fund. And Elise froze at the sound of her name, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as the camera zoomed in on a blurred image of her entering the Bank of Cascadia branch months earlier. She looked at me as though I had personally placed her on the broadcast, despite the fact that her own actions had paved every step of the path leading here. And she whispered, "Please, Lane, please shut it off." But I left it playing because this was the truth she had refused to see for years, and truth is not always gentle, it is not always soft. Sometimes it is the only way to cut through the fog of entitlement someone has wrapped themselves in. When the segment ended, I finally picked up the envelope, weighing it in my hands, feeling the heft of the cash, the cheapness of the attempt so perfectly aligned with the pattern of her life. And I set it back on the table, sliding it toward her this time, and said slowly, clearly, and without tremor, "You never gave me anything but pain, Elise." The words landed with a heaviness I had not anticipated, because for a moment her expression cracked, not with manipulation, but with something like recognition, as if she finally heard the sum of every wound she had inflicted through every joke, every remark, every dismissal. And when her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands, my chest tightened. Not with sympathy, but with a deep, quiet release, because I realized I owed her neither comfort nor explanation. She kept pleading from the floor, saying she could change, she could apologize, she could undo what had happened if I just cooperated, but I knew then that she was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking for escape. She was asking for the world to bend for her one more time, and I was done being the person who bent. I stepped aside, retrieving the envelope from the floor, placing it firmly back into her shaking hands, telling her that she should keep it, because she would need every dollar for what was coming. And then I opened the door, waiting silently until she understood the finality of the gesture and gathered herself enough to stumble into the hallway. She looked back once, eyes swollen, voice small, saying my name as though there might still be hope for salvation. But I closed the door gently, firmly shutting out the storm she had carried with her for years. And for the first time, I felt the clean, sharp certainty of a boundary that would not break. In the weeks that followed Elise's late-night visit, the investigation moved with a momentum that no one in the family could interrupt, because the evidence I had gathered aligned seamlessly with the audit team's findings. And for once, the truth did not wobble or bruise under pressure. It stood firm, unshakable, and almost startling in its clarity. And when the official report was released, the language was clinical but devastating, outlining each unauthorized withdrawal, every fabricated signature, every concealed transfer. And the conclusion stated plainly that Elise bore full responsibility for the misappropriated funds. The ruling required her to repay the outstanding losses over time and prohibited her from managing or accessing any family-related financial accounts for a minimum of 10 years, a restriction that stunned the relatives who had once worshipped her. Confidence and flair, and now whispered among themselves as though the very mention of her name might incriminate them by association. I attended the final audit meeting not out of obligation, but because I wanted to witness the moment the fund that had been twisted and distorted by entitlement finally returned to the purpose my grandfather intended. And when the chair of the review board announced that I had been selected as the new custodian, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, but a sense of restoration, as though a fracture that had existed within my family for decades had begun to close at last. I accepted the appointment not as a victory over Elise, but as a responsibility I was finally allowed to fulfill. And one of my first decisions was to rename the fund, choosing a title that carried both memory and direction. The Lane Equity Fund, a space dedicated to helping women who faced financial abuse or economic manipulation, a quiet nod to the struggles I had endured and the silent battles countless others continued to endure in homes that looked stable from the outside. Establishing the new mission brought a wave of media attention reporters eager to cover a case that blended family turmoil, financial fraud, and the unusual resilience of a young woman standing against generations of dismissal. And the headlines were flattering, sometimes overly so, calling it a rare example of successful internal accountability within a private family system, and casting me as a symbol of perseverance. Though in truth, I felt less like a symbol and more like someone finally breathing without restriction. Nevertheless, the attention generated donations and partnerships faster than I could have anticipated, and the fund began to grow into something larger than its original purpose, touching lives outside our family circle, and catching the notice of organizations that had long been fighting the same battles from different angles. A few weeks later, I received an email from a national nonprofit specializing in financial abuse prevention, an organization that consulted on federal policy and trained state agencies, and the director wrote that she had followed the case, closely admiring the rigor of my investigation and the calm, decisive way I had handled each public stage of the conflict, and she asked whether I would consider joining as an advisory member for a new initiative focused on safeguarding family-controlled assets from internal exploitation. The message stunned me, not because I doubted my ability, but because for so long I had lived in the shadows of louder relatives, convinced by their constant remarks that I was forgettable, invisible, and too quiet to lead. And now people far beyond Portland were asking for my insight, acknowledging the strength I had learned to cultivate in silence and sharpen under fire. The invitation included travel to Washington, D.C. for a roundtable event with policy experts and advocates, and although several major brands had also reached out offering sponsorship deals, promotional partnerships, and speaking engagements, I declined each commercial offer, choosing instead to commit to work that aligned with the values my grandfather had instilled in me years ago when he told me that numbers never lied, and neither did integrity. Preparing for the trip to D.C. felt surreal. I packed the same silver watch that had anchored me since childhood, feeling the steady weight of its history against my wrist. And as I reviewed briefing documents on the plane, I realized that I was no longer reacting to the family's cruelty or trying to survive their dismissals. I was building something entirely separate, something they could never diminish or distort. The round table in D.C. exceeded anything I had imagined, because the room was filled with individuals who had spent their careers studying the intersection of finance and vulnerability, unraveling patterns of exploitation that often hid behind closed doors in households that claimed to be loving and stable. And as I spoke about the audit process and the psychological dynamics that had shaped the mismanagement of the fund, I felt a rare and powerful alignment between my lived experience and the structural issues the group aimed to address. Several participants approached me afterward, expressing gratitude for my candor and insight, and one senior advisor for a national coalition remarked that my perspective filled a gap. They had been struggling to articulate a validation that left me quietly overwhelmed, because it affirmed that my years of silence had not softened my voice, but instead distilled it into something precise and impactful. When I returned to Portland, the Lane Equity Fund was already expanding through new partnerships and support programs, and as I reviewed proposals from women seeking assistance, I felt an unexpected calm, a sense of stepping fully into a role I had unconsciously trained for through every hardship, every betrayal, every moment I had been underestimated. What had begun as a family conflict had transformed into a platform that extended far beyond my own story. And though the attention still felt strange at times, I embraced the work because it offered something my family never had: a structure built on fairness, transparency, and the belief that no one deserved to be diminished or dismissed, especially not by the people who claimed to love them. In the months that followed the fund's transformation, I found myself settling into a rhythm that felt foreign at first because it was built not on survival or appeasement, but on intention and quiet authority. And when I finally moved the Lane Equity Fund into its new workspace, a renovated suite in a sunlit building in downtown Portland, I walked through the glass doors with a sense of ownership that felt both new and achingly overdue. The space was modest but warm, filled with soft light from high windows that stretched across the north wall, and I spent the first morning arranging files, organizing meeting notes, and selecting the framed photographs of women whose stories had shaped the early months of our work, each face representing a victory that extended far beyond numbers. Once everything was in place, I carried my coffee to the rooftop terrace, where planters of rosemary and lavender perfume the air, and the autumn sun cast a gentle glow across the city skyline. And as I leaned against the railing, watching pedestrians drift below, I felt the rare quiet of a life no longer dictated by other people's expectations. For years, I had existed in the shadows of louder relatives, those who filled space easily and assumed the world owed them something. But now I inhabited a place carved entirely by my own choices, and the view from that rooftop felt like stepping into a version of myself I had always been meant to reach. I had barely taken my second sip of coffee when my phone buzzed with a call from the building's management office, and I answered expecting a routine maintenance update. Yet the property manager greeted me with a formal warmth that suggested something more significant, and she said, "Ms. Hart, we need your approval on the new lease terms for the second floor before we finalize them." I froze for a brief second, the kind of stillness that arrives when the mind tries to reconcile two realities at once, because the second floor was not a space I rented or supervised. It belonged to the building's ownership portfolio, and as far as most tenants knew, the owners were investors based out of state. Yet the property manager spoke as though my involvement was obvious, as though this was not news at all. I asked her to clarify, hoping I had misheard, but she repeated the request, politely explaining that lease agreements for tenant expansions required sign-off from both primary owners, and that my digital authorization from years earlier remained active and valid, and I felt a slow, dawning realization wash over me, a memory stirring from the edges of decisions I had made quietly when I was younger. Decisions no one in my family had ever bothered to ask about because they assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck. Years earlier, during my first internship, I had invested steadily in small Oregon-based development projects, choosing low-risk holdings with long-term growth potential. And one of those projects had been the restoration of this very building, a venture I contributed to modestly but consistently accumulating enough equity over time to become a minority co-owner, a fact I never announced because I had long ago learned that silence protected me far better than sharing ever did. As the property manager spoke about upcoming renovations, I realized that the life my family had mocked me for leading, the quiet, frugal, calculated life they dismissed as small and forgettable, had in fact built a foundation stronger than anything they had imagined, and the contrast between what they believed me to be and who I had become felt almost poetic in its symmetry. When the call ended, I remained on the rooftop for a long moment, staring at the city bathed in gentle light, feeling something settle inside me. Not triumph exactly, but a soft, unshakable assurance that every choice I had made, every moment I refused to bow to their cruelty, had led me here. I thought about Elise and my mother and the chorus of relatives who insisted again and again that I was not enough, not capable enough, not bold enough, not valuable enough. And I felt no anger now, only clarity, because their blindness had never defined me. It had only revealed the limits of their own imagination. I returned to the office and sat behind my desk opening the latest proposal from a woman seeking help to rebuild her financial independence after years of being controlled by a partner. And as I read her letter, I understood something with absolute certainty that the fund was never just about correcting what Elise had broken. It was about creating the space I had needed all along, a space where women who had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed could reclaim the power that had been taken from them piece by piece. When I closed the file, I whispered the sentence that had carried me through the darkest moments of the past year, a sentence that felt like both truth and reclamation. I was not wasted on anything, I was simply underestimated. And for the first time in my life, the words felt not like a defense, but like a declaration, a quiet, unarguable fact shaping the air around me as surely as the sunlight warmed the office floor. If you have ever been underestimated or dismissed, share your voice by commenting, "I deserve better," and know that I read every word.